Hello all you guys in the Academy land, Mark Daniel Nelson here for a nice, long, expressive chat about reverbs. Here's my template. You can see quickly if I go to percussion verbs, I have a handful of different types of reverbs ready to go. My main one is the original 480 on the snare plate. And then I have some other stuff like the UAD EMT 250, the plug-in version. I also had the hardware. Some plate stuff, Valhalla, Wasted Space, and then this Atlantis reverb, which is a new one over the last 6 months, but incredibly special. And if you see, it's popping up in a ton of these areas on my template. Quite a bit, actually. If I'm going back down, though, you can see that I have a 250 send going to the real hardware 250. And I also have some of the 480, believe it or not, being used as well on the snare. So if I take out just the snare and listen to it on its own. Now if I pull in the 480, and then if I pull in the 250, quite a bit different. Here's the 250 alone. Here's the 480 alone. Why do I use two reverbs? For the snare drum, for me, I felt like getting a little bit more top end out of that snare without EQing the snare, or a little more sustained top end, if that makes sense. You're getting that really kind of sharp, high, glassy sound out of the snare with the 480 plug-in. And the difference between that and the EMT 250 is the graininess of the EMT. Now it's funny, I'm not totally sure what sound is going into the modeling of the EMT 250, but I think John McBride and I had a real long talk that we think it's a plate, essentially. The reverb is modeled off of that, I think. So if you think about a plate in terms of what it's doing, it's a little darker. It might be a nice like zippy effect on some vocals. Sometimes the S's and stuff trigger plates in a weird way. The EMT reverb, the 250, the digital reverb, just has this kind of grainy, thick, dense thing, which really ties it together incredibly well. Now if I went back, open this up, if I went back to the track on its own, I think it's probably a smart move for us to kind of listen to the song, and then we can kind of dissect and go over what the reverbs are doing for what and why I've chose that. This tune has a lot of blended reverbs. Is another conscious decision of doing this today was talking about blending reverbs and why certain types of reverbs go really well together and some don't. And a lot of that can be frequency response of the actual source. So let's listen to the track from the top. We'll go through halfway and then we'll come back and talk about it a little bit about the reverb.
Saw you staring through the bottom door. Do you feel it, babe? Cause you think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing. You cut me off without a warning, but I think I could love you through and through. Oh, it's in the in the way she knows. I said, oh yeah, it's in the way she knows. I said, oh yeah, it's in the way she knows. Oh, it's in the way she knows. The way she knows. All the ways I try to cross her mind. Oh, it's in the way she knows. The way she knows. All the ways I try to cross her mind. All the ways I try, all the ways I try to cross her mind. All the ways I try, all the ways I try to cross her mind. Saw you staring through the barn door. Do you
You
feel
can only listen to it until we start going backwards again. Great track. Feels like everything is gluing really well together. This is a first pass I've listened to since I sent it to master, and pretty happy with it. I know that Alex was a big focus and fan of making sure that the reverbs were done tastefully but had a specific character on the track. And listening to it, I can tell you that we did seem to get that well under focus. Well focused is probably the best way of saying it. A lot of that is blending reverbs. Now, when we were playing it, I was listening to the snare and the percussion and hearing what that kind of response was. And to be honest, I was wondering if the percussion reverb and the snare 480 reverb were the same, and it is. Going back and seeing that the room is 1.8 on the snare and on the percussion. Now, stuff like claps and stuff, it's going to be very apparent. So if I go in and focus on some of these claps and just solo out the claps for a second, this is just a percussion. You can hear that there is a decay, but the initial thing, the early reflection, is what's causing that kind of flutter slash almost slap back on the reverb. It's a very short slap, it's very bright, and then there's a slight decay after that. If I go back to late 80s stuff, 90s stuff, early 2000s stuff, records that I really liked growing up, things that made a lot of sense to me when I was engaging in music when I was younger, some of those reverbs were really important to the mixes. A lot of that was Tom Lord-Alge, Chris Lord-Alge, Bill Schnee, Al Schmidt, Ed Cherney. I mean, a big, immense amount of it was that era of using specific reverbs to kind of gain trust in your audience, to feel like you're in specific environments. Listening to this specific reverb on the percussion, I always thought about those short room stuff. And I know I've talked about my favorite little snare reverb I have that I don't like to use on everything, but I have it in my template, and that is this impulse from the 480 called the Music Club C. That is also a very, very short reverb. And it works really well for rock stuff, but it wouldn't work really well for this stuff. Even though I'm trying to get it on the snare drum, it would just feel like it'd be a little too aggressive. And to be honest, let's give it a try. I'll pull up another reverb on the drum room, and that is the snare reverb I'm talking about. So if we can just hear the drums for a second, I can show you what I mean. So that is the impulse I would take from the original 480 that is now in a IR wrapper that I use through Waves. That just triggers that one hit. If I pull up this snare 480 snare plate, just has a little less abrasive sound to it. I know it's a different setting, but it also means that it's just reacting differently. But remember, that is the same reverb as the claps, which are very aggressive, kind of slapback. So depending on the source you're driving into it, usually high frequency transient stuff, it's going to trigger the reverb. And a lot of those old units had really under par converters at the time that give it a shitload of the sound, to be honest. 16-bit, 12-bit converters. And those things had a weird aliasing issue, and they would clip really weird really quickly. So if you sent in a snare drum into it and it would clip into it, the reverb would sound different processed, which is an interesting concept. And the impulse that I have, I'm wondering if some of that is in play there, because it's like a one-shot and it's a little harsh and it's a little bright, but it works super well in rock stuff or heavy stuff that's going on that you need a little space on your snare drum. Let me just take that off. I can come back to the 480, but let's revisit the 250 sound. It's a very classic sound. Essentially, you know, if you put a gate on it, it would have that very, very 80s sound. On this track, I didn't want it to be too dated sounding, so I kept it back enough, but created the space from it. If I open up the UAD EMT 250 and take out the insert of the real thing, let's see if I can get a sound similar to what we have on the hardware. Pretty close. So that's the reverb of the plugin. Here is the real hardware. Now it does sound similar, but the difference is that the hardware seems to have a little more separation from the actual source. That isn't pre-delay. That is actually probably something about the latency that's taking it to go into its own universe and then coming back in to the system versus a standardized plugin here. It's very close, but again, it still doesn't do what the real guy does very well. It just feels alive to me. Now again, it's very vibey in the sense of doing what it's doing, and it kind of reminds me of a vibe. Like, oh, is this 280s? That's why when you wrap it up with the 480, put the groove going in. Getting a little bit, just a little bit of that sustain of the reverb inside the track, which is kind of gluing everything together, and it's making it all sound really nice. Now, if I decided to use, let's go down the line of my reverb settings, let's say the Abbey Road plate on the snare. Same track. Let me take the EMT off. Thing about the Abbey Road plate, though it sounds great, it's a little flat sounding, and I noticed that with this Abbey Road on some sources, on the drums specifically. On acoustic guitar, it seems to hug the acoustic guitar really well, different than, let's say, a drum, unless it's like a one hit or what you need. Something like that, you can open up the damper and it expands a lot longer than you want it to be, traditionally like in a drum groove. if I move down the line of reverbs, let's actually go into this Atlantis plugin. Same send. I'm going to pull back the decay a little bit and see how we have the feeling here. What I'm hearing on this track, as cool as this reverb is, it is totally not accurately well suited for this drum track. Only in my taste, because I feel like you're trying to be lifting up and that chamber seems to be setting things back. So something to think about when you're putting stuff on drums or percussive stuff that seem to be sticking out a little bit harder is they end up wanting to be able to be surrounded in a very holographic way versus it being flat. And that can be in the box or that can be out of the box depending on the track you're talking about. But most of the time, if you blend certain options together, you can get that 3D image really well, really easily. So this is actually the EMT and the 480 that we originally started on. The plug-in on both ends. Another neat part about the EMT is this lever right here is focused on mid-low frequencies. This is focused on high frequencies. So if you higher you go, the brighter the snare gets. The higher you go on this lever, the more thump or wooliness you get out of the snare. Let's try that. Do you hear the snare thickening up? It's kind of hard to hear if you don't solo the drums, but if you start messing with these two levers, they really do come in handy when you're trying to get a little clarity out of whatever you're putting it into. So if this was on your acoustic guitar track and it was getting a little too woolly or too boxy, I would make sure this is down, or I would brighten it up a little bit here and maybe even use the pre-delay to separate it a tiny bit. I don't spend a ton of time with the delays, the phaser choruses on this box or the real hardware because I don't really use a terrible amount of hardware delay or chorus or phasing. I feel that plugins for me, for what it does, it's usually an effect and it needs to come in and out quickly. And it's a lot easier to have it going through a plugin, obviously, than hardware.
Hey everyone, Eric from Produce Like a Pro here. I hope you're enjoying the video so far. For more videos like this, be sure to check out producelikeapro.com. Here, our members get access to premium courses, over 150 multi-tracks, drum samples from our mentors, exclusive discounts from top audio brands, and get access to our private Facebook or Discord group to get to know our community of like-minded producers, engineers, and mixers. For content like this and more, be sure to check out producelikeapro.com. Back to the video.
I want to listen to the vocals again because I know that I have some delay throws going on, but also I've got the real 250 on it. I've got the Bricasti on snare chamber, even though we don't have a Bricasti or a Seventh Heaven on the real drums. So it just again shows you that using specific kind of algorithms that might not necessarily be the wise choice to put on a vocal like a snare chamber is accurate, unless you're kind of blending certain things together. And once I start dissolving these reverbs, I can show you slowly what it's doing to the vocals. So let me open those up.
Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing. You'd cut me off without a warning, but I think I could love you through and through.
On its own, pulling in the fab filter. Again, you've seen this in the past with other videos and my template. This is the setting that I like to use for that really, really dark ambient, extremely expressively humongous reverb. It has a 8, probably even a little longer second decay, and the top end is slowly rolled off and the bottom end is boosted out. This took a little time to get the setting just right for vocals, but it always seems to work if I'm looking for this extremely expressive, deep reverb. But I do know that this doesn't do the things that I need it to do on shorts. So sometimes adding a little bit of a 2-second reverb with it adds a little bit of that top end brassy stuff that triggers off of the S's and stuff and makes things a little more percussive. So when you blend the two together or blend 3 reverbs together, you're getting its own vibe. And usually that's where you get the holograph sound from. So listening on its own to the fab filter, again on the vocal.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause I think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing.
You're seeing me do some of these throw boosts, automation boosts on certain words because I'm trying to expand some of that reverb. On its own, it sounds way too muddy and too much. But inside the track, there's some sort of ducking thing that's happening when I'm starting to blend these reverbs. I'm going to take out the fab filter. I'm going to go over to the 7th Heaven Bricasti that's set on the snare chamber.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause I think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you...
So that's my small room reflective percussive reverb tone. And then I have the same setting on the hardware 250.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause I think I...
This is the same setting as the drums. Exactly. But it's interesting because it sounds like a completely different reverb on a vocal.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause I think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store?
Let's take out the plugin and put in the hardware and see what it sounds like.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause I think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm all...
So this is probably a 2.5 second decay. The 7th Heaven Bricasti sound of the snare chamber is probably a 1 second decay. I can tell you just by the control I'm using. Okay, so that's not accurate because I have it set here. It's a little different. This was actually set to the sunset chamber, which is not accurate because I remember the preset I have here is the snare chamber. So I'm going to look here. 1.3 seconds. So it's a little over 1, almost under 1.5 seconds. Combining those with like the fab filter and then combining that with the EMT, you hear a reverb that kind of goes like this.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause I think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you...
Let me take out the 7th Heaven again, the short reverb.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause I think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause...
Taking out the hardware EMT, putting in the plugin, same sort of setting as we were trying to get.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause I think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing. You'd cut me...
The thing about the very short reverb that's gluing with the super ambient large reverbs is that the short reverb is a little more kind of short, grabby, percussive sounding reverbs. And those are important when you're trying to do little movements on the drums, hi-hat groove that's tight. Anytime there's a reflective, kind of short reflective sound on the reverbs. For me, it just reminds me of that era of like the Collective Soul albums and stuff like that that used quite a bit of those short room reverb sounds. I don't know if that was AMS. I don't know if it was Lexicon, but everything like in that was going through percussion or stuff that had that kind of percussive sound seemed to use these really short grainy reverbs. So blending that into a larger reverb, you tend to get a way cooler effect. Pulling in the track, let's just listen to the huge ambient reverb on its own.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause you think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing. You cut me.
Let's pull in that short reverb, same spot. Listen to the percussive side of the way that he's singing.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause you think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing.
I know this sounds ridiculous, but it's actually improving the groove of the drums. I believe these were fake drums, and they sound very cool and very, very yacht rocky, very Fleetwood Mac, very vibey. But the way that I know the records used to be mixed in the 80s and stuff, like Tango in the Night, give you a perfect example. Crack open Tango in the Night and listen to a bunch of the Fleetwood Mac tunes on that, and how Lindsey Buckingham sings and uses the percussive side of the reverbs to blend the drums together. Because Mick is always playing a really simple groove, but the way that Lindsey would write those songs on that album, he would use really short, grainy reverbs that would also create these kind of ambient, kind of percussive, aggressive vibe that, combining to the drums, created a new groove on its own. So again, this is without that small reverb on the vocal.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause you think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing.
Same spot with that short reverb again. Listen to the groove of the hi-hat.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause you think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing. You cut me off without a warning, but I think I could love.
So again, sometimes you can make a reverb stick out a lot more in the drum sound by bringing in the reverb harder on the vocal. It's a kind of weird dichotomy of problems. If it gets too like messy, essentially just too much, then you're in a big problem. That's when start pre-delaying. That's when you have to start deciding if this is going to be that kind of really, really oversaturated reverb track. For me on this song, I feel like, yeah, there's a lot of reverbs, but it's ducking nicely. The way that you have the settings just go well enough to each other. You don't have to do any kind of trickery with any kind of side chaining, ducking, or stuff like that. If I pulled in the hardware 250, or right now the plug-in version of the 250, the vocals sound even more percussive and groovy because it's going to add just another step of the glue, of the reverb.
Do you feel it, babe? 'Cause you think I feel it. Don't you wanna know what's in store? 'Cause I'm always looking for something more, but you act like I'm another thing. You cut me off without a warning, but I think I could love you through and through.
Coming into the chorus. One thing I know that was requested when we were mixing this was to make sure that the higher chorus vocal was on top. By doing that, I was able to watch my output of the reverb as well and actually make it sound a little more dry in the chorus aspect, even though it's being triggered off the same send. Sometimes you have to follow your gut. For this, when Alex was like, I want to make sure that the lead is higher than the main, my gut was saying that seems odd to me at the time because it didn't seem to switch well. But then he explained the philosophy of why he decided to choose that, and it made a lot more sense. It's a lot more of a change in the atmosphere, and you can hear that between the verse and the chorus.
Throw and throw. Oh, it's in the way she knows, the way she knows. Oh, the ways I try to cross her mind, all the reasons I should let go.
Now, if I save this for a second and call this reverb, I can now mess with it a little bit without worrying about the save session that I have. I can now send, let's see, the Burkasti is going to stay the same. You all right, Atticus? Seems to be very grumpy today for some reason. I take out the 250, the Burkasti, and I leave in the reverb long send, but let's replace the reverb itself.
Throw and throw. Oh, it's in the way she knows.
The Atlantis plugin that before on the drums didn't sound very good or didn't work well for this track, I have a good feeling that it will probably sit pretty good on its own. Because again, this one's also a very expansive long decay, and it should sit well rounded with the track.
Throw and throw. Oh, it's in the way she knows, the way she knows. All the ways I try to cross her mind, all the reasons I should let go. Painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. God, if I could find a way, but you'd act like I'm another thing. You'd cut me off without a warning, but I think I could love you through and through. Oh, it's in the way she knows, the way she knows. All the ways I try.
Before we get into the guitar part, I do want to talk about what we just heard here. This is a cool reverb because it allows you to get dirty with 3 different sections EQ-wise that are kind of programmed off of the original chamber that was modeled on this track of this plugin. I think this is a soft tube plugin. Yeah. And just a very, very cool, unique sounding reverb. If I toggle through the microphones, the cardio A is a 47, figure 8 looks like an old RCA, and these look like some sort of KM84s or something like that, and as well of a cardioid. The Omnis are, I don't even know what those microphones are. They look like old dynamic microphones. And there are a couple different choices in chambers. I'm not totally sure what chamber off is, but I'm not really going to go through this plugin terribly. So if you know what it is, or you want to try it on your own, play with it, go play around with it a bit. There is some cool stuff on here, some modern trick things with ducking and dynamics and stuff. I don't really get into that terribly, of course, on this track. But what I'm noticing when I put this on this track, it totally changed the vibe of the song. I feel like the song with the other reverbs made it feel nostalgic, but at the same time modern. This reverb seems to make things just kind of sound ambient, but doesn't have enough character
Throw and throw.
to separate itself.
Oh, it's in the way she knows, the way she knows.
Back to the top, first verse. Actually, let's take it on the second verse.
All the reasons I should let go. Painted cut me off without a warning, but I think I could.
I don't hate it. It's just a little... It does kind of have a modern sound that is probably not right for my taste for this track. So if I take this out and we hear the old, larger reverb blended with the other reverbs, it goes like this.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. And oh my God, if I could find a way, but you'd act like I'm another thing. You cut me off without a warning, but I think I could love you through and through.
The groove has changed. It just feels a lot more relaxed blending these reverbs. You're putting a little bit more depth between the listening space and maybe behind the listening space where the band's playing. For fun, because that's what we're doing today. We're doing a deep dive into reverbs and stuff. If I pulled up this EQ a little bit, it's going to do what? So let's listen to see how the vocals respond to pulling some of this top end back up on the reverb. This expressively long reverb.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control.
Bring it back down. A little more mellow, same area.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. Oh my God.
So, perfect example of what it's doing is obviously it's a lot more mellow, it's darker. I know a lot of people are afraid to put EQ, compression, dynamic, even delays in the front end of reverbs. And why not? I think a lot of that is the idea that there's some settings there and you just kind of want to leave it. But to be honest, you're creating space around what you're trying to design it to be. And by moving stuff around or darkening stuff or boosting up low end, for this one it was more about the group side of the low end of this long extension reverb. If you listen to it on its own, remember it sounded a little too much until you started blending all these things together. That's another reverb thing to think about. I do this a lot in orchestras. So in an orchestra, let's say it's playing in a pretty decent sized room, but when you're making a movie and you're doing a score for a film and it's something like a 15 to 25 piece orchestra, you're going to want some of that glistening air, large ambient, kind of not reverby, wetty kind of sound, but more of this kind of cinematic sound that happens when you're recording orchestras in a big hall or a big space, like a stage. Depending on that decay time, you have to kind of fiddle with stuff. And another way to get around that and do certain cool little apparatus tricks or moving around with different reverbs is to blend these reverbs to make sure that you have the right amount of decay time and the right amount of ambience around the sources. Without making it too complex, that is usually based around your EQ settings and what you're using. A lot of the settings I like to do for orchestra reverb is usually tied to a couple different versions. The first one I have, and my main favorite one, other than the Bricasti, is this Liquid Sonics Cinematic Rooms. This is one of my favorite settings. I think I snapped it from, I don't even remember where I got it from, but I did remember getting it and being like, there's your ambient sound. This is a very kind of organic room sound. Unlike a chamber that's real, they were usually incredibly bright rooms and shimmery sounding. Like live spaces, larger spaces like an orchestra stage, though sounding decay lengthwise large, it's not necessarily like you're walking into a gymnasium where everything's like, which is why, when you're hearing certain orchestra stuff, it's really soothing and smooth. And again, you can see some of the roll-off stuff. So for fun, before we move over to that guitar spot, I'm going to take the reverb out again on the vocal and then the other substitute reverbs that we had going with it. And let's just listen to the cinematic room and play with that, just so we can hear the difference of some of these reverbs.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control.
It's actually set really short, so I'm going to pull this in.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on.
Make sure these are on.
All the reasons I should let go, painted.
Okay.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. And oh my God, if I could find all the reasons I should let go.
I just figured out what I'm doing here. Okay. So, what I'm noticing though is for this plugin,
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. And oh my God, if I could find a way, but you'd act like I'm another thing.
reverbs are funny. They all sound so different and instantly changes the vibe of a track. I can actually hear this working if you would set it specifically to a little larger sound and maybe roll off some of this. Same spot, let's hear what this sounds like.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. And oh my God, if I could find a way, but you'd act like I'm another thing. You'd cut me off without a warning, but I think I could love you through and through.
I actually really like the way that sounds. What does it sound like with the other reverbs put in together? I have the delay sends off because that doesn't matter for this track right now.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. And oh my God, if I could find a way, but you'd act like I'm another thing. You'd cut me off without a warning, but I think I could love you through and through. Oh, it's in the way she knows, the way she knows. All the ways I try to cross her mind.
While we're listening to that, I'll take this out, same spot, and pull in the fab filter again. Same spot.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control.
Revert that back.
All the reasons I should let go, painted on the walls in the middle of the night, but the serotonin takes control. And oh my God, if I could find a way, but you'd act.
Perfect example. Actually, now, if I was mixing this song now, I would probably go with the cinematic rooms, blending with the other reverbs instead of the Pro R. Perfect example of not understanding that using different reverbs at different moments can trigger your emotions differently. Actually made my night to think about this to the point where I'm going to save this as an additional super long reverb. So I would go super long verb. So for the future, I'm going to put this into my template as well on my vocal long reverbs so I can toggle between these two, because this is just a little different sound. This one was very dense, the fab filter. This one's a little brighter, but it just has this width space thing that I was listening to where it sounded like it was there, but it wasn't aggressively too much. And literally going, okay, that works really well for this. If I adjusted the pre-delay a little longer, and maybe if I sat in the song a little bit more, I could get it to sound really good dialed in compared to the fab filter. Now, before we wrap up today, I want to go over the guitar reverb stuff, because again, I want to show you what I was having my settings on the lead guitar, because I have two different reverbs again on this one. The reverb on this guy is the spring reverb, and then the snare chamber again. So if we go to the guitar solo, which is coming up right here in the blue, and I go over to the actual part and solo guitar, bring up the reverb, so I have this spring only on the hard left. Why did I hard pan this reverb on the guitar? The sneaky reason why I did it was because when I got the guitar, the lead guitar, there was some phase or chorus on the lead guitar, and it was stereoized, so it almost sounded like a Leslie or something. And by hard left or hard righting the spring reverb, because the spring reverb is such a personality and it's kind of shimmery and springy sounding, that it just made it shoot out to the left a little better. So if I take out the spring reverb, listen to the guitar in the mix by itself, and then I'll come back, bring in the spring, and listen to how it almost expands, widens the actual sound without it sounding too wet. Here's without. Full mix. Okay, same spot with the spring reverb, only on the hard left. That will actually push out the reverb just a little bit. It's creating that illusion of the guitar being a little less claustrophobic, a little less trapped inside your headphones or inside the speakers. It's pushing it out organically based off of the trigger of the reverb itself. It's a little pokey on its own, which is why I would use an additional reverb as well. So adding in the Seventh Heaven Berkasti, it sounds like this. What you're trying to avoid here is things sounding like they're stepping on top and just getting too messy and too kind of just too much. A lot of reverb becomes too muddy and just aggressively dated sounding. There's a sound from the 2010s of this really aggressive, bright kind of plug-in-y. I call it plug-in-y because it all reminds me of the Valhalla kind of vintage verb stuff, because there was a lot of guys using that specific reverb and a ton of settings on that, and it instantly made it a sound. It works pretty good sometimes, but it's also similar to like using a decapitator that has a very specific sound. So if you're gonna do certain things, why don't you customize it a little bit, because what will happen is you can stand yourself a little separate from where everyone else is being at when you're kind of starting to add different reverbs or blending different reverbs, because everyone seems to be able to have the same reverbs these days. If it's all in the box, pretty much everyone's using similar stuff, but each one kind of tuned a little differently from each other, or this obviously comes up on B, but trying it on D one day can be different than trying it on B. Obviously, those are two different plates modeled. One might be a little brassier, one might be a little less brassy. You just got to keep funking around with the stuff. And reverb is really tricky, and this is my closing statement for today about the reverbs. It's a little tricky because what it's doing is you're trying to create a synthetic, natural environment to listen to your music. And it could be fantasy, it could be dreamy or whatever, but you don't want to stop in the middle of your listening and go, that sounds like reverb, or what reverb is that, or that's too much reverb, or that's getting in its way. So you have to be really cautious about the percentage rule about giving too much reverb into your sends, or doing too much pre-delay, which is causing the separation between the dry and the start of the wet signal. Pre-delay is going to be another discussion on its own down the line with you guys, but essentially for me in pre-delay, and I know I've done a video about it a little more in depth in the past, but I think I can get a little more juice out of today's talk with the pre-delay talk, and that is be careful with your pre-delay, because it can instantly muddy up your mix if you don't know accurately what you're doing. There's a lot of people that tempo it, and then that creates a weird cohesiveness between the mix. I like to stay roughly around 70 and 120. Those are the two areas that seem to work really well with me on vocals. 70 was Ken Kelly's favorite area. 120 reminds me of some of the older separation stuff that you can get some really big, deep vocals that don't sound too wet. But then putting that 120 behind it, it's big after the fact. So it's almost like a natural ducking thing. And depending on the tempo of the song, you can move it a tiny bit. But when you start getting too mathematically correct, like matching tempo or BPMs to kind of sync certain things together, it just starts sounding too rhythmically cohesive, and then you're losing a lot of the danger and a lot of space of that, which is another story about delay. So in theory, I think that kind of wraps up my little demonstration today about kind of forking around with different styles of reverbs and why ones seem to work well with the others and why others don't work so well with some. That's pretty much it. I wish you guys a happy mixing week and hanging out in the Academy. Send me some emails. Let me know how things are going. Love to hear your mixes. Another thing is, some of the songs that I've been sending out as multi-tracks, would love to hear you guys' mixes on some of these. I mean, I think a lot of it is all about the interaction of what you guys are doing. Handful of times when we include multi-tracks and stuff to some of these projects, we try to make sure that we're getting feedback from the people that are hearing it, because we want to hear if you're digesting the same way that I did when I learned the trick that I was teaching in the same course. So we, especially me, would love to hear some of the mixes you guys are doing, and just enjoy yourself and play around with the reverbs, play around with the pre-delays, play around with different types of the styles. A 480 by UAD could be completely different than the other variations of that 480. They all sound different, and that's the whole key about mixing. Have a great week.